nope, nope. Yeah, you'll be ready to go. There'll be a little singing before you come on. Hello, everyone. Okay, please take your seats, please. Freshmen and sophomores and those who like to sing might want to stand over there. Stand here.
We know that everybody likes to sing. So we're going to do some of the songs from our class. So if you've been with us the last couple of years, either as a student assistant or as a freshman, please join us. Please sing a little bit.
Okay, while our singers come up here, we welcome everybody to our lecture. And let me also point out that our next lecture is May 1st at 7:30, right here at the Free Church. And Daniel Matthews will be our speaker, and he will be speaking about the natural history of our mountains here. Well, we typically begin with a prayer and then a poem, but we are a school that does not only pray and do poetry speaking, but also by singing. And today we'll be singing a prayer and our poem.
So, invite everyone to stand. We're going to sing, O Heavenly King. It's an invocation of the Holy Spirit. If you know it, please join us.
Thank you.
Sorry, juniors and seniors, but I have to admit I am very much looking forward to the day when I will not call the two classes forward, but I'll just say all students stand and sing. Our lecture tonight is sponsored by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Formed in 1953, the ISI is an organization devoted to promoting conservative values and thought on American campuses. They're built upon core principles that align well with our own. One, the purpose of education is to hand down and sharpen timeless ideas. Two, discourse is central to a flourishing society. And three, our nation's civic life should be grounded in the full heritage of Western civilization. ISI has chapters at dozens and dozens of colleges and universities across the country, and one of their chapters is located right here at Wyoming Catholic College. Thank you to Diego and Barrett for their service in organizing this chapter, and I urge you, underclassmen especially, to get involved and to keep this chapter going strong here at WCC. Many thanks to ISI, and special thanks to Alana McKinnon, who is here in the back, Programs Director at ISI, for making the very long journey here today. I'm very happy today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Luke Foster. I'm very glad he is here. He made it. Despite postponed flights, canceled flights, he somehow appeared. Thanks to the lead foot of our Father Deacon. Dr. Luke Foster is an assistant professor of government at Hillsdale College in Washington, D.C., and the co-founder of Academia Tocqueville, an annual Paris-based seminar in French political thought. Tomorrow in the Winthrop Room at 4 o'clock, please feel free, students, to talk to him and to learn more about these programs. Dr. Foster earned his Bachelor of Arts from Columbia University and then both a master's and doctorate from the University of Chicago. He has held prestigious research fellowships, one at a political science institute in Paris, Sciences Po Paris, and another in the States at the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government at the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Foster is now researching and teaching on issues that concern American and French political thought on aristocracy, democracy, and the role of the university in elite formation. His writing has appeared in numerous journals, including, here's a long list, the Tocqueville Review, American Political Thought, the Political Science Reviewer, Laws, Modern Age, and Modern Intellectual History. He is now completing a book manuscript entitled Beyond Meritocracy, The Pursuit of Excellence in America. Tonight, we will hear about education and excellence, as well as humility, I think, and we'll be looking at some ideas from the French tradition, as well as from our new English Doctor of the Church. Please welcome Dr. Luke Foster.
All right, well, I hope this microphone is working. Thank you very much, first of all, Dr. Zepeda, for all his work on the back end to coordinate this, make this happen, to the college for inviting me, to the ISI for sponsoring and helping put this on, to Alana for an intrepid journey, having lost her suitcase, and of course to your president for being a quite wonderful chauffeur. I will confess, I woke up many hours ago. I left home 16 hours ago, so I may interrupt myself to sip some coffee every now and then, and please forgive me if the digressions are worse than usual. but I will do my best to be somewhat focused and hopefully say something of interest here. And I should say, I don't want this to be a mere research presentation. I very much hope that this talk and the themes it raises are certainly, hopefully, interesting, personally edifying for you, but hopefully also bear on, are pertinent to the work of the college and its mission. So if and when you see such connections, I certainly hope there'll be good time in the Q&A to go into them. So to begin with, and let me just make sure this works. There we go. I want to start with, I think, it is a relatively widely recognized phenomenon or problem today, which is nobody really likes or wants to own up to, no one really likes the existence of an American elite, and hardly anyone likes to own up to membership in such a thing. There's a little bit of the sort of Animal Farm, all of us are equal, but some of us are more equal than others dynamic, right? Where all of us who are honest recognize that concentrations of wealth and power and access to the corridors of influence are real, but at the same time, we're a democratic republic. We believe in equal citizenship and equality of human nature and equality before the law and all those good things. And so those good commitments, I think, sometimes make it very difficult to actually speak honestly and well about the duties of those with greater position in society, and also to diagnose their vices and think about how to remedy them. But my academic training is in politics. I hope politics is of interest, at least to some of you here. I think the good political thinking has to diagnose and maybe even prescribe better ways to lead and govern society. And one of the things that almost anyone who thinks about this will also agree on, at least, is that higher education, especially some colleges and universities, has an outsized role to play in defining, in shaping what the American elite is and how it acts, right? And there are roughly, characteristic critiques or denunciations, even if we get more violent in our language, of the college-educated, the academic elite, right? The people who come out of a place like Harvard, from both left and right. So on one side here, I put up the Winklevoss brothers from The Social Network, right, who are sort of the left stereotype of privilege, obnoxious fraternity brothers, athletic, inherited wealth, easy time starting companies, et cetera, right? That you get less of that nowadays, but certainly in the Occupy Wall Street movement 15, 20 years ago, this was the rhetoric, right? It's still with us to some extent. And it will come back at times. It always resurfaces. On the other side, I think you have the characteristic fear from the right. If ordinary Americans who tend to vote red have an image of Harvard Yard, they think of it this way, right? Hysterical protesters, ridiculous slogans, right? Bloodthirsty language invested in conflicts on the other side of the world, right? This is from the post-October 7th Hamas rally, not quite clear what it was, on Harvard Yard just 2.5 years ago, right? So these are the cliches of each side. And I have to say, one of the interesting things living and working and teaching in DC is the elite academy is not doing much to disabuse people of these impressions. Right? The Department of Education under the second Trump administration produced this interesting document called the Compact for Academic Excellence in American Higher Education, slightly a mouthful. But essentially it was a deal proposed to a number of not quite Ivy universities, right, but rich, powerful universities. University of Texas at Austin featured prominently, Notre Dame, MIT, interestingly. And the deal was stop doing diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Stop promoting woke ideology, essentially. Stop flouting federal law. And the federal grants will keep flowing generously to you. And you might even be exempt from the endowment tax, right, which is now threatening the, sort of the passive revenues of the big universities. And almost all of them rejected it. There were a couple interesting exceptions, actually, like MIT and Texas. But the fact that a very easy off-ramp from ideological polarization that would subsidize universities to focus on supposedly their core mission of educating young people to love and care about their republic was rejected says a good deal, right? These places are not willing to reform, and they're certainly not willing to be seen to do so with conservative pressure. So, the problem runs deep. But what I want to argue is, with full honesty about the problems, I also want to argue we can't simply work our way out of this situation by saying elites are bad, get rid of them, right? All we need is the people. Right? For one thing, we've seen this movie play out a few times before in history, right? And what tends to happen is that from the ashes of the revolution, new elites arise, who are often worse than the previous ones. And there are many reasons for this, but at least one obvious one seems to me is there are, in a large, complex modern society, lots of things that require specialized knowledge and expertise. I happen to use central banking here as one example, but there are many others. You can't do away with that entirely. Ordinary common sense doesn't actually get you well-crafted policy. Why do elites seem to be inevitable? Right? I actually think this is a digression. We can go into it more in Q&A if you'd like, but it seems to me that it's rooted in nature in some quite profound ways. Right? The mixed regime, the idea of the excellent few and the popular many cooperating, recurs over and over again in the history of, I think, wise political thought. One example that strikes me as very important is in September 1792, right, this is the beginning of the most radical phase of the French Revolution. The September massacres have just happened, right? So hundreds of priests have been slaughtered in the streets of Paris. The revolution is getting more and more paranoid, more and more violent. The Prussian army has invaded and crossed the border. And according to the Republican myth, right, if you totally believe the French revolutionary ideology, what happened next is the ordinary tradesmen of Paris rose up, seized muskets, and went to defend the border and beat back the Prussians at the Battle of Valmy, they were scattered like leaves before the wind to see the people in arms. There were popular volunteers who were significant. But what happened first was the Prussian general, you have to picture professional drilled army here, runs into a very precise, disciplined cannon barrage that lasts for hours. And this is the highly trained engineers of the old Royal Army who went to all the best engineering schools, who put together their best artillery work. That gives the Prussians pause. And then they see the muskets and the ordinary citizens, and that turns them around. You always need both, I think. So in our time, elite universities have a big role to play in producing elite leadership. And if we're talking about reform, we're talking about diagnosis and prescription of the problems, I think we should dream big. We should say, what would the good version of an elite be? What would worthy leadership in our kind of republic look like? Right? And then we can talk about what it might take to get there. Right? But at least we should be clear on the goals. And I think you can make a long list, but 4 criteria that I think are particularly salient are excellence, meaning, and by this I mean moral excellence, right? The wisdom to understand human ends and purposes well, and the qualities of character to pursue them. Because how do you deliberate well about what we should do collectively unless you understand something about the goods of human life. They should also be technically competent, right? That's the central banking part. They should actually know cause and effect and the feedback loops of policy and think through the consequences of their decisions. They should also be responsible, and by this I mean almost in the Federalist Papers' core sense, right? They should be capable of responding to the people. Right? There should be a tether, a feedback loop between popular concerns, popular frustrations, and a response in leadership. It seems basic, essential. And I didn't put it, you could put humility, which is obviously a virtue, just under excellence. But I break it out as its own separate category because I think it's a distinctive and difficult virtue. It's much more of a specifically Christian virtue. There's no humility in Aristotle's catalog, right? The Christian tradition, the Christian mindset has much richer resources for combining loftiness, excellence, grandeur, and a willingness to submit to a standard of the good far above oneself. Right? That no matter how excellent we are, we don't actually define the criterion of goodness. So I'll come back to these, but that's my sketch. So just to give you a sense of where I'm going in the rest of this. We've already had section 1, so you're 1/6 of the way done. I want to look at democracy's end next, by which I mean both telos and where it trends towards over time. And we'll be using a friend of mine, I hope a friend of yours, Alexis de Tocqueville, for that. And then, of course, Tocqueville's own counsel on education, looking at what he says about colleges specifically, which I think interesting that he uses that word. And then I think a danger or a weak point in Tocquevillian thinking on this matter, which I want to address with his near contemporary, St. John Henry Newman, slightly younger than Tocqueville. I don't think they ever crossed paths, but there are many interesting and rich convergences between their thinking. But I think in a certain way we need to bring one to the rescue of the other on this topic. And then I'll end by considering magnanimity, the aspiration to greatness, and its actually, I think, paradoxically, very close relationship to humility, this distinctive Christian virtue. Okay, long way to go. So democracy's end. Tocqueville closes Democracy in America with this famous, very troubling worry about le despotisme doux, which is usually rendered soft despotism. It's gentle or sweet despotism, right? There's no iron fist. It's just more of a chloroform veil that descends over you. In fact, he doesn't really think that personal tyranny is a problem in the modern age, which is maybe a mistake. It's an interesting, striking claim. He says, I see an innumerable crowd of similar and equal men who spin around restlessly in order to gain small and vulgar pleasures with which they fill their souls, is my emphasis. When no citizen has great power or great wealth, tyranny lacks in a way opportunity and theater. Since all fortunes are mediocre, passions are naturally contained, imagination limited, pleasure simple. Now, we might quibble with some of this, right? I think actually technological developments since Tocqueville's time have concentrated wealth and power in new ways that make this diffusion analysis not fully convincing. But there's clearly something here, right? Democracy trains the moral and political imagination to see each of us as so thoroughly equal that each of us also becomes isolated, self-enclosed, to the point of feeling vulnerable, maybe even desperate, for a comforting, guiding hand from above. And so, paradoxically, it's actually in the sweetness and the gentleness of rule that a new form of tyranny can take root. Tocqueville's getting this very striking image of sweet despotism from three major sources. One is Blaise Pascal, who writes really 2 centuries before Tocqueville. Pascal's analysis is that when man wishes to play the angel, he plays the beast, right? Our proudest self-assertion when we think we're doing the very best is actually precisely when we ensnare ourselves again, when we fall into new servitude. And he means this on the personal, moral, spiritual level, but he also is interested in this on the social and political level to some extent. And Tocqueville takes up that thread and runs with it. So this is Tocqueville, not Pascal. If a man was forced to prove to himself all the truths that he uses every day, he would never finish doing so. He would wear himself out with preliminary demonstrations without advancing, as he has neither the time, because of the shortness of his life, nor the ability, because of the limitations of his mind, to act in this way. He is reduced to holding as certain a host of facts and opinions that those more clever have found that the crowd adopts. So this is the paradox, I think, very familiar, right? Particularly to those grounded in the Catholic intellectual tradition and those who read the great books, right? That it is often precisely when we are proudest of being innovative and original and having thought for ourselves that we're actually most dependent on usually the watered-down, thin gruel version of a very old idea, or frequently, sadly, just we're tracking roughly what we think people like us think. Right? What is so much of how ordinary people reason is actually just what's typically thought, what is expected, what's socially normal. Right? And this power, the power of public opinion, the power of the majority, is amped up in democracy. Right? So what Pascal saw as a human problem, Tocqueville sees as a particularly democratic problem. Okay. Next, right, there's these 3 great French predecessors whom Tocqueville draws on for this. The second is Montesquieu. Montesquieu says, the reason why medieval kings couldn't really be tyrants is because they had aristocracies under them. Right? The nobles could contest their power. And in some ways, this is very, very literal, right? The barons have fortified houses, stone castles, and private armies. And in fact, the royal army of medieval France relies on the barons to bring in their retainers, whom they fund and equip to fight for them, right? There is no professional army or formal state, really, beyond the loose agreement of the nobles. So this necessarily keeps power, to a certain degree, decentralized. Right? So the painting here, sorry, the first painting was Edward Hopper's image of American loneliness, but the second, this is from the uprising called La Fronde, the last major attempt by the nobles in the 1650s in France, when Louis XIV is still a boy, to resist the centralizing power of the monarch. Right? And it's very bloody, doesn't end well for anybody. But Montesquieu thinks, despite the sort of quixotic, almost self-destructive nature of this for the aristocracy, this was a more than an institutional arrangement, right? More than just a contingent thing the Middle Ages happened to get right. Because fundamentally, what is it to be noble for Montesquieu? It's to seek honor and to be willing to die in the pursuit of honor. Right? There are things you value more than your bodily life and security and comfort. And, for old-time aristocrats, this takes the form of risking your life in duels. It can look pitiful, but Montesquieu's point is there's something essentially human here if we want freedom to be more than just leave me alone. And so Tocqueville takes this up in his book on the old regime and the revolution. He says, what has always kindled such a powerful love of liberty in the hearts of certain men is its intrinsic attractiveness, its inherent charm, independent of its benefits. You don't make a calculation about what liberty is going to get you. If you're in that kind of mode, you already have lost your freedom. Whoever seeks in liberty anything other than liberty itself is born for servitude. Tocqueville has a certain paradoxical relationship to his own class, right? He's from the minor nobility of Normandy. He admires some of their virtues, but he's also, he wants them to figure out a way to adapt to modern circumstances. But he doesn't want them to lose this quality. In fact, he wants it to be taught more widely. So one of the things he admires in Americans is that it has been diffused through the body of the people much more widely than in France. Third great source, perhaps they're the most philosophically consequential of them, is Rousseau. And Rousseau's teaching, Tocqueville thinks, is particularly attractive and particularly dangerous for democratic man. Because Rousseau says, okay, Pascal, man is lonely and restless. Okay, Montesquieu, we're in danger in rational, bourgeois, commercial society of losing the willingness to die. What's the source of human greatness and human nobility now? It's going to be plumbing the depths of your own soul, a kind of poetic, spiritual exercise where you learn to see the magnificence of the churn of your own passions. And if you do this well, Rousseau's whole philosophical project in a way is to teach this, you'll be imminently content. You'll be fully satisfied with yourself and your own life, and you won't need to search for anything beyond, anything transcendent, anything beyond yourself, right? I mean, complicatedly, this is not a talk on Rousseau. There are people here who know him far better than I do, but in a certain way, it's self-deification, right? You want to make your own soul the most beautiful and attractive thing in the world. And Tocqueville thinks this is the end, right? If democratic people start believing this, not only will they not be free, they'll be debased beyond recognition. It must not be believed that in any time and in whatever political state, the passion for material enjoyments will be able to suffice for an entire people. The heart of man is more vast than you suppose. It can at the same time enclose the taste for the good things of the earth and the love of the good things of heaven. By the way, there are very, very learned Tocqueville scholars who read that and think that Tocqueville is somehow a deist or even a materialist, which I find very strange. Right? He's clearly saying that the freedom Montesquieu wanted has to be combined with a real spiritual, transcendent anchor point. Even if he's not quite an orthodox believer, that's another matter. Okay, soft despotism is all around, according to Tocqueville. What can you do about it? Right? What keeps democratic societies free as well as equal so that these three sources of corruption don't take hold? Well, first of all, it's very important that Tocqueville doesn't take the classical solution directly. He doesn't say you can have a formal aristocratic element, or something like a distinct social class that's represented in the upper house of the legislature, something like the Roman Senate or the House of Lords, for a formal mixed regime. Right? He thinks that the popular tendency is too strong to resist in democracy. So you don't do that. You don't confront it head on. Instead, you look for resources in civil society outside of formal politics that will keep these sources of freedom alive, and in fact can ennoble the discourse, the thinking, the sentiments of democratic man. And the three most important, the three that receive the most treatment in Volume 2 of Democracy in America, the thing that most Tocqueville scholars, the ones that most Tocqueville scholars will talk about, are well known. It's religion. He's very clear, actually, you need transcendent historical religion, and you need the incarnation, even. Without an established church, but you need a real vital Christianity, essentially. You also need a rich, intimate, affectionate family life, because the family, right, the link between parent and child is the most natural and most basic form of hierarchy, right, which sets a certain bound beyond which democratic equality can't go. It is perhaps interesting and significant that these first two are so eroded in our own society. Right? And then, of course, associations. Right? And this is where we can risk hearing Tocqueville as saying, wasn't it so great back in the 50s when people went to the Rotary Club? It can sound like a sentimentalism or a nostalgia to us now. But he actually says associations are ways of replacing the aristocracy. Right? The citizens pooling their talent and their wealth to build things, to take care of the sick, to educate the young, to petition their government. That's actually the equivalent to the old castles and the old retainers, in that they're real sources of power that contest, that prevent everything from being sucked to the center. Okay. Tocqueville does also very briefly and tantalizingly say the university might have a special role to play in this catalog of aristocratic, sort of replacement aristocratic bodies, neo-aristocratic bodies, if you will. He calls them heritages of aristocratic centuries. And I started thinking about this partly because this is an academic procession with a chancellor's mace. So much of the ceremonial of academic life is just straight out of the Middle Ages. Right? The professoriate is one of the last medieval guilds, with many, many Byzantine rules, formal and informal. Right? It's very hard to imagine that in a purely egalitarian democratic society, you would just start off with universities. They are one of those precious heritages of aristocratic centuries, which have adapted and flourished in really interesting ways in the democratic age. So I think they're a very promising site to think with Tocqueville about what could be done. Okay. An aristocratic thing that higher learning does is it teaches you old books, or at least Tocqueville thinks it essentially ought to. Things that are older and wiser than yourself and that command a certain authority, greater than public opinion or private judgment. But Tocqueville also knows this is very dangerous. Right? So the painting here is the Oath of the Horatii, exhibited on the eve of the French Revolution, wildly popular. Right? Let's be Roman again. Right? Let's get Roman heroic devotion to save the patria. What could possibly go wrong in the 1780s in France to live that way? Well, Tocqueville thinks, if you persisted stubbornly in teaching only literature, but this he means classical literature, in a society where each man was led by habit to make violent efforts to increase his fortune or to maintain it, a commercial bourgeois society like our own, you would have very polished and very dangerous citizens. For since the social and political state gives them needs every day that education would never teach them to satisfy, they would disturb the state in the name of the Greeks and the Romans, instead of making it fruitful by their industry. This is in that one little chapter on education. Much of it is a very serious warning. Right? And he's thinking, at the time he's writing this, he's reading Plutarch for the first time. And he writes to his old friend, Gustave de Beaumont, who did the famous American trip with him. He says, I fear my mind is crammed with a heroism that is hardly of our time. And maybe I'll become, quote, mad in the manner of Don Quixote. Right? He's worried about becoming an anachronism in his own day. And I think, those of us who love ancient literature can feel this, right? It can make you ill-fitted for functioning, productive lives. There's a way out of that thicket, but the flip side, Tocqueville does say, is that very longing for greatness, that very sort of quote-unquote uselessness that the ancient books can cultivate, can really ennoble particular souls. Right? So the image here is Abraham Lincoln teaching himself Shakespeare. And Tocqueville says, Greek and Latin must not be taught in all schools. Don't try to do this on a mass scale. But maybe a small college, maybe 200 students. It is important that those destined by their nature or their fortune to cultivate letters or predisposed to appreciate them find schools where they can perfectly master ancient literature and be thoroughly penetrated by its spirit. So the problem of Rome LARPing is cured by actually knowing Rome well, right, with good teachers. And then you get ancillary benefits. You don't just get a few noble souls who are incapable of communicating with their fellow citizens, you might actually get an ennobled public rhetoric. Right? And Tocqueville's quite impressed by the quality of Senate debate, what's going on in Congress in his day. And there are a couple interesting, tantalizing remarks on what ennobles American speaking and American language in Democracy in America. At first he says, "There's scarcely a pioneer's cabin where you don't find a few odd volumes of Shakespeare. I recall having read for the first time the feudal drama of Henry V in a log house." And the irony there also is Henry V is about the 100 Years' War. His family's castle was the frontier between England and France for a while. Right? So it's set in his backyard, literally, and he's reading it in the woods of Michigan, which is kind of cool. But then he says on congressional eloquence, he says, "The English orators of the last century constantly quoted Latin, even Greek, at the rostrum." He's thinking of people like Edmund Burke in the House of Commons, right? Who really did this. They're just like discourse in Virgil. Their sons of America quote only Shakespeare, the democratic author par excellence. But if you've only got Shakespeare, that's pretty good. And that's pretty far above where we are today. But the taste for good letters, Tocqueville really does think can do things in public life. Right? It's not doomed to be just make you a personal Don Quixote on your own. Okay. How can it do that? Well, again, we come back to that longing for transcendence. Right? This is oh, sorry. Getting out of sync here. This is an image of Vanity Fair from Pilgrim's Progress. Tocqueville very much thinks, right, that you need to keep alive the sense that you are a pilgrim on a progress. You can't just be content with the things of this world. And politics should reflect that in some delicate way. It must not be believed that at any time, in whatever political state, the passion for material enjoyments will be able to suffice for an entire people. This is his attack on Rousseau that we already looked at. This entails a responsibility for public officials too, though. It's not just a matter of, again, keep the poetry alive in your own heart. He says, legislators in democracies and all honest and enlightened men who live in democracies must apply themselves without respite to lifting up souls and keeping them pointed towards heaven. And I think, by the way, that the appeal to honest and enlightened men who live in democracies is obviously an appeal to readers of Democracy in America, right? Because why would you work through this huge, difficult book unless you were honest and enlightened? It is necessary that all those who are interested in the future of democratic societies unite to spread within them the taste for the infinite, the sentiment for the grand, and that's grandeur in the French, very freighted, weighty word, and the love for non-material pleasures. And he goes on to say, the heads of these new societies, again, legislators, statesmen, must sometimes give the citizens difficult and perilous things to do in order to elevate ambition there and to open a theater to it. I mean, I think this is sort of the space race theory of the presidency almost, right? This is what John F. Kennedy thought he was doing by proposing a new frontier. Right? And it's interesting to think of what the analog would be. But democracies need great projects. They can't just be satisfied with safety and prosperity. According to Tocqueville, at least. Take it up with him if I'm wrong. Okay, but those who've been well catechized are going to hear a real danger of pride in this, right? What about the hubris of democracies? Right? What about Periclean Athens launching the Syracusan expedition, right? In the name of being, our collective project is so great, we can forget our limits and destroy our own polities. And of course, spiritually, but we might destroy our own souls, and that's worse. So Tocqueville does explicitly recommend pride as a counterweight. Well, let me read the quote and then I'll gloss it. So far from believing that humility must be recommended to our contemporaries, I would like you to try hard to give them, interesting, you here again is the reader, I think, to give them a more vast idea of themselves and of their species. Humility is not healthy for them. What they lack most, in my opinion, is pride. I would willingly give up several of our small virtues for this vice. He calls it a vice. So I tried to save Tocqueville, because I love the man. I want him to be right. French has two words for pride, the two common words for pride. L'orgueil, which is arrogance, superbia in Latin, right? Thinking too well of yourself and asserting an autonomy, a spiritual autonomy that doesn't belong to you. Right? And fierté, which is the virtuous sense of pride, right? Usually gratitude for something unearned, joy in participating in something greater than yourself, which calls you to a standard of excellence, right? The sense in which we say, I'm proud of my child, right? I'm proud of my family name, right? I'm proud of my country. In English, we always have this duality where you never quite know. Typically, pride is bad, but we do have a sort of a subordinate sense in which it can be a qualified virtue. French usually distinguishes the two. But Tocqueville just goes for the bad one. So I couldn't save him. It seems like a better diagnosis of the problems of the democratic soul than a healthy prescription. And one of the key things that's happened since Tocqueville's time, right, he's starting at a time when the university is very small. Sorry, when the college is very small, right? When Harvard and Yale are this size, right? A couple hundred students, a few dozen faculty, intense small residential communities. And in the decades after his visit, the next 60, 70 years, the rest of the 19th century, something very striking happens, right? The research university model takes over and doesn't quite become the whole of American higher ed, but it becomes the dominant model, right? And what's so striking is this is a new and more hierarchical institution arising in a democratic society on the basis of the democratic need to be productive, efficient, to master the earth, to tame the West, to make the fields bloom. We need expert research, rationally organized. And what happens when you have expertise institutionalized? You get hierarchy. So the research university is much richer, much bigger, and much stricter. Right? We get all these German-style ranks, which we still have, of university professor, professor, associate professor, assistant professor. It's a little pompous. But it's all grounded also, curiously, at the same time, on the critical and scientific spirit, which is to say, all truths are to be evaluated based on their empirical demonstrability. You don't take anything on authority or on the basis of tradition. And so these places tended to drive out, well, either shrink the space for or drive out the classical, canonical works. And so what you got, and this is fast forwarding in some ways to present problems, but over the long run, what this creates is a new form of political hierarchy in which it's very hard for ordinary people to evaluate the claims of their supposed leaders, right? Because if someone claims to be morally excellent or politically wiser than me, I can still roughly test and evaluate that, right? Because I know something about virtue, I know something about wisdom, even if I'm not the paragon. But if my heart surgeon claims I need triple bypass surgery, I have a very hard time evaluating whether he's right or not. Because my knowledge isn't even on the same spectrum. The internet's changed that somewhat, but basically, expertise concentrates power and makes it less accountable, less responsible in that Federalist Papers sense. So, what's very interesting to me is that within Tocqueville's lifetime, John Henry Newman is writing a book on the university, not on the college. Right? He is thinking about something more ambitious than just a small residential community. He's thinking about a place that claims to teach universal knowledge of the whole of human things and to equip its graduates to go out and set the tone for civic and national life. Newman's goals with the Catholic University in Ireland are very lofty, not really realized institutionally, but that's another matter. Newman wants the fundamental ethos of university teaching to be receiving and delighting in a gift. Right? It's not primarily discursive knowledge earned. So he describes the university several times in this gratuitous way, in the idea of university. An assemblage of learned men, zealous for their own sciences, which means disciplines, and rivals of each other, are brought by familiar intercourse and for the sake of intellectual peace to adjust together the claims and relations of their respective subjects of investigation. Sounds like a faculty curriculum meeting, right? They learn to respect, to consult, to aid each other. Hope the best kind of meeting. Thus is created a pure and clear atmosphere of thought, which the student also breathes. He profits by an intellectual tradition which is independent of particular teachers, which guides him in his choice of subjects and duly interprets for him those which he chooses, not stranded, isolated, trying to make up everything for himself, the Pascalian, Tocquevillian mind. He apprehends the great outlines of knowledge, the principles on which it rests, the scale of its parts, its lights and its shades, its great points and its little. A habit of mind is formed which lasts throughout life, of which the attributes are freedom, equitableness, calmness, moderation, and wisdom. And of course, Newman thinks you have to study and work hard, right? But the point is, all of this is not in a spirit of grasping, I've earned it, because I'm so great, you know, it is owed to me to possess this knowledge, right? No, it's something you breathe. It's the air that is already there if it's been well cultivated by your teachers, and you are initiated into it. This is why the old quaint grammar is not I graduated, but I was graduated, right? You're initiated into something that surpasses you, and which of course you should live up to. It enjoins all sorts of duties upon you, but it's actually not your own merit, right? This is why, side topic, but why I think meritocracy language is actually very corrupting for precisely the very goods that we want to preserve and cultivate. Newman's account of this is a deeper theme in his thought, and again, there are people here who know Newman's theology and philosophy much better than I do, so I hesitate to say much about it. But Newman has a really beautiful essay on Benedict of Nursia called The Mission of St. Benedict, which gives you a sense of what he means by receiving education as a gift. Is the aim of science, and here he does mean modern, scientific research, is to get a hold of things, to grasp them, to handle them, to comprehend them, to master them, or to be superior to them. There's a kind of dominating impulse in the critical scientific spirit. But as to the poetical, it demands, which he identifies with St. Benedict, it demands as its primary condition that we should not put ourselves above the objects in which it resides, but at their feet, that we should feel them to be above and beyond us, that we should look up to them. That's the fundamental posture of Benedictine education, which Newman says created the template for really all Catholic teaching. Right? This is, in many ways, the pedagogical foundation of the West. And Newman, of course, says, then you can go on to scientific and discursive reasoning, right? But first you should approach the whole as gift reverently, and then you should come to try to apply your knowledge and make use of it. It's secondary. But the Oxford of his day was not doing a very good job at that already, Newman thinks, and I shudder to think what he would say about Oxford in 2026. Because what the Oxford he loved should have been doing, Newman says, is precisely connecting this gratuitous liberal spirit, taking in a gift beyond yourself, to the duties which then are incumbent on those who've received so much. So he says, there's a duty we owe, this is back in the idea of university, I'm sorry. There's a duty we owe to human society as such, to the state to which we belong, to the sphere in which we move, to the individuals towards whom we are variously related and whom we successfully encounter in life. And that philosophical or liberal education, if it refuses the foremost place to professional interests, does but postpone them to the formation of the citizen. So the sequence here is philosophical liberal education, learning to receive the gift of being, civic education, then what does that entail for how you should bear yourself towards those with whom you're related, and especially your fellow citizens? And then what does it entail professionally, right? In the particular station in life in which you find yourself, in the particular field or task that comes before you. Right? These aren't competitive, and they can actually be rightly ordered. Right? But all three are genuinely good and noble for Newman. And really what he's talking about, I think, is the virtue of magnanimity, which is a almost quaint virtue now, right? It's a mouthful to say. Pusillanimity, its concurrent vice, is even harder to say. Smallness of soul, pettiness of soul, I prefer to translate it. But how can you be, oh, Cardinal Newman, both genuinely zealous to be great and aware of the great gifts you've received? St. Paul says, regard yourself with sober judgment. It might be that you're the best person for the job. In fact, I suspect it is true of many of you, about many possible jobs. However, how do you avoid letting that go to your head and becoming not only spiritually inflated and proud, but also self-defeating, right? Because the proud person is actually the most useless. Right? There's nothing actually worse for a task that needs doing than a proud colleague. So the things that Newman is assuming, which he goes into at times in the idea of university, are at least twofold, I think. One is a metaphysical confidence, right? A principle really as old as Plato, but that he's particularly getting from Thomas Aquinas, that the good is diffusive of itself. Though the useful is not always good, the good is always useful. Good is not only good, but reproductive of good. Nothing is excellent, beautiful, perfect for its own sake, but it overflows and spreads the likeness of itself all around it. Good is prolific, is not only good to the eye, but to the taste. It not only attracts us, but it communicates itself. It excites first our admiration and love, then our desire and our gratitude. The intellect is not only beautiful, perfect, admirable, and noble in itself, but in a true and high sense, it must be useful to the possessor and to all around him. I was thinking about how on earth to illustrate this, and then I realized that the spreading... Oh, I'm sorry. The good is failing to be diffused. Can we recover the PowerPoint? Yeah, there we go. That's an image of the spreading of the candles at the Easter Vigil, which is encapsulation of precisely this principle. Okay, so in other words, the better, the nobler thing you have, the least you could possibly bear not to share it. So it's actually, again, it's part of justice toward others to do and be the best you can. That's not pride. Okay, but there's a pitfall. Again, gratitude is a prerequisite virtue for humility. Right? The recognition that not only is your education a gift, but actually being itself is a gift. Right? The fundamental disposition of created things is to receive their natures and their ends from God. Right? So Newman warns very sharply, almost terrifyingly, about the damnable danger of getting liberal education in a worldly sense without that metaphysical grounding, so that you become actually convinced of your self-sufficiency. Right? You actually think you can do the thing that Pascal and Tocqueville say you can't do, which is reason through everything for yourself. So he warns, liberal education makes not the Christian, not the Catholic, but the gentleman. It is well to be a gentleman, but it is no guarantee for sanctity or even for conscientiousness, even for ordinary human decency. And the image he's really drawing on is Gibbon's portrait of the death of Julian the Apostate, right, which is one of the most chilling passages in the idea of university, right? Because Julian, in a certain sense, was the consummate philosopher king, right? He had his lovely Platonic learning, and he said, in the name of restoring the academy, I'm going to turn back the clock. We're going to de-Christianize the empire, and we're going to have high priests of paganism again. In fact, there had never been high priests of paganism before. It was already a kind of Christianized paganism, but leave that aside. Gibbon, right, in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, portrays the death of Julian as this beautiful, noble, serene moment, right, where that was super inspiring for the anti-clerical side of the Enlightenment. Right? Julian is discoursing on reincarnation, the migration of souls, until the very end, right? Until he can no longer speak because the pallor of death is spread across his face. And Gibbon says he had nothing to regret. He didn't ask pardon for anything. And Newman says this is precisely the very worst kind of educated person. Right? This is the very thing you don't want to become. In the insensibility of conscience, in the ignorance of the very idea of sin, in the contemplation of his own moral consistency, in the simple absence of fear, he didn't even have basic natural fear of death, which is a mark of sanity, actually. In the cloudless self-confidence, in the serene self-possession, in the cold self-satisfaction, we recognize the mere philosopher. It's pretty dark. Okay. So what's the good version? Newman ends Discourse 7, which I believe is titled Knowledge in Relation to Professional Skill, with this short list of the good things that really doing the liberal education, which is in a certain sense for its own sake, the good benefits it will bring to bear on the surrounding society if you do it right. So, the training of the intellect, which is best for the individual himself, best enables him to discharge his duties to society. These are raising the intellectual tone of society, cultivating the public mind, purifying the national taste, supplying true principles to popular enthusiasm, and fixed aims to popular aspiration, which I think is very interesting for the mixed regime question, right? You have to listen to what the people want at their best, but purify and elevate what they're really getting at, because they won't be able to articulate it for themselves. Giving enlargement and sobriety to the ideas of the age. Right? Each age has certain things it's going to get right, but they need to be brought into conversation with other ages and made sober, not puffed up. Actually facilitates the exercise of political power, because power well exercised is a good thing. And it will also refine the intercourse of private life. It will beautify conversation, family life, friendship. And all of that is part of a good culture, a good society too. So to juxtapose with the American Senate, I gave you this is an image of the House of Lords. But Newman is thinking about parliamentary eloquence again, like Tocqueville. But I think he has the metaphysical grounding and the consistency in his use of his understanding of virtue to supply what's lacking in the Tocquevillian account. However, simultaneously, Newman's politics is frustratingly, radically underdeveloped. We have a great treatise on the university. We have only, occasional sermons and essays that touch on politics from Newman. Right? So I think these two contemporaries need to be made complementary to one another. Right? The sort of lapsed Catholic who could never really get away from a Catholic worldview, but who's perhaps the greatest analyst of democratic society and politics in Tocqueville, and then the great doctor of the church who takes on all the skepticism of the 19th century and provides the foundation for being modern and Catholic in a deep and serious way in Newman. Right? They need each other. So in conclusion, to bring in yet another thinker, magnanimity and humility actually are flip sides of the same coin. Right? Because both involve this posture of gift towards what God has bestowed on you, and then an earnest spirit of serving as best you can, right? Meeting the needs of the world. And so Joseph Pieper's little essay on hope captures this very nicely, but he's riffing on the Secunda Secundae of Aquinas, the treatise on fortitude. So Pieper says, magnanimity is the aspiration of the spirit to great things. A person is magnanimous if he has the courage to seek what is great and becomes worthy of it. Right? Magnanimity always involves work to become worthy of the greatness you aspire to. Right? Pride, in the negative sense, is always complacent. Always says, I am already the finished article. I don't need to do any work. Right? Humility is only apparently the opposite of magnanimity. Humility is the knowledge and acceptance of the inexpressible distance between creator and creature. It's only if you have that grounding that you can actually do the love of greatness well. I think that's a pretty good mission statement for any educational project. But I hope it connects well to what you're doing and what you're experiencing here. Any questions?
Thank you, Dr. Foster. I'm sure there are many questions. I'll be bringing the microphone around. Just raise your hand if you have a question, please.
I also know it's very late in the evening, so if you want to flee away, don't feel bad.
Thank you, or merci. My question is it possible to do what you're talking about in the United States today? Socrates refers to democracy as a sort of tyranny of the majority, and it seems like that's definitely reflected in academia right now, in the universities, and even in rejecting the federal grants in exchange for the woke education that's provided. So is it possible to do this? I guess what I'm asking is it possible to do this on a grand scale in America, or is it kind of, if you are trying to be liberally educated, that's just going to be contagious in your community? What's that going to take, or is there a way to practically implement it in America as a whole, seeing that we're kind of at maybe what is the most tyranny of the majority that we can have right now, and we're not at our best? So I was wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Thank you. It's extremely broad and very important, and so if I don't address all of it, please forgive me. I mean, first of all, it's not the worst it could get. It can always get worse. I haven't seen a guillotine set up yet. It could come, but we have a decent measure of freedom and order, and it's worth being grateful for. Look, I mean, I think fundamentally your answer to this depends on whether you think the trend of democracy towards what he calls what Tocqueville calls imaginary equality, right? By which he means not fake, but in the imagination. To what extent that is the only principle at work, right? So if you read Tocqueville as a historicist who basically thinks the flow of history is toward the democratic age and we're necessarily going to wind up in soft despotism, then sure, there's very little you can do about it. Maybe you can create some dikes and channels for the flow and create some pockets that are a little better. But Tocqueville's not Hegel, right? Tocqueville disavows that on every page. He says there's things you can do. The movement is not unidirectional. And I actually think he thinks aristocracy is grounded in nature in a very similar way to democracy, right? The equality of all human beings by nature is real and has very powerful effects even on regimes that don't recognize it. But the unequal distribution and cultivation of excellence is also real and will have effects even on regimes that don't recognize it. So to give you an idea of what I mean, trying to establish excellence that is worthy of imitation, if that's true, is actually working with human nature, and people actually want it, whether they kind of have the vocabulary or the concepts, the conscious concepts for it. I will say one of the very interesting things in DC since November 2024, really January 2025, is seeing one governing class very visibly replaced by another. Right? Not all, there's still some career civil servants, but an awful lot of the people who dictated the mores of DC, and to an extent through the power of the federal government of the country, have left. And like, it's not cool to have blue hair on the streets of DC anymore. Right? Like, it makes a material difference in how people not just conduct themselves in like the policy briefs they write, but the things that are viewed as beautiful, noble, attractive. Which is to say, human beings are mimetic. Human beings will always imitate one another. Right? There have to be standards to aspire to. And because also we're incarnational beings, we experience those standards best when they're embodied in people whom we can admire and love. And therefore, again, some kind of elite will always arise. The question is what it embodies, what it stands for. And so I think, of course, you want to do bottom-up, organic civil society work to create and cultivate good people, but you also want to shape the institutions such that they can be seen and imitated. And I think, we're seeing some, however imperfect, attempts to do that at the national level now. I don't think that's a silver bullet that will solve everything, but I think it should be done as well as it possibly can be. And then at the same time, you want to be, you want to be creating art and literature and philosophical arguments that are just obviously better and more excellent than the democratic slop or muck that gets churned out. Okay? And it requires hard work because you have to resist the inertial tendency. But you are still working with a part of nature. I hope that, again, there's much more to go into, but I hope that's the beginning of an answer.
Thank you for your lecture. I won't say that I have two questions because I don't like it when people do that. I have a statement and a question.
Excellent. Honesty.
The first is perhaps an attempt of a defense of that part of de Tocqueville that you said was undefensible. I'm wondering, right, Aristotle says that every virtue is in the mean, right? There's a vice on either end.
Yes.
And that if you have fallen towards one vice, he uses the analogy of like a metal rod bent out of shape, that you have to bend it towards the other. So I'm wondering, or I'm stating, that maybe he is seeing this pusillanimity, and telling people to aim at pride so that they'll reach magnanimity. And then my question is, Aristotle also talks about a few different kinds of mixed regime. And he says the one in which you have the aristocratic and democratic balancing each other can be good almost in spite of the two elements, right? Where they're both aiming at kind of bad things, but they balance each other out. And the one that he sees as sort of intrinsically good in and of itself is the one that has a strong middle class. Yeah. And so I was just wondering if you could say something about that.
Sure, yeah, thank you. Both excellent points. Yeah, I mean, I think the passage from Aristotle you cite is the source of the idea of agire contra, right? To counteract your inclination. Whatever vice you incline towards, lean more heavily on the other side. And as a matter of, I think, personal, self-discipline, that's a good idea. Right? But I still don't think you should ever consciously cultivate a vice. Right? Consciously cultivating the excess of a certain virtue, right? Like, let's throw myself more daringly into noble and difficult things because I know I might be tending to sell myself short. That's good, right? But it's even if all he's doing is mislabeling it and saying, orgueil rather than magnanimity, there's still there's still a miscatechesis there if you dwell on it and you fill your imagination with it in the wrong way, right? So my correction is meant to be gentle and charitable, right? In the sense of, here's a better vocabulary for thinking about the very thing you were getting at. But he's certainly right, and one of the main forms of human pride he wants you to cultivate is the conviction of your own free will. Right? You're actually a free and responsible being who isn't just stuck in a general historical tendency, but can actually make decisions and govern responsibly. And that's absolutely a good thing, and something we're very much in danger of losing. And we are the most sovereign country in the world, the one that has the best prospects for self-government, and still we might lose it. So on that practical level, it's good counsel, but the conceptual mistake can still lead to other mistakes down the road. And then, yes, the middling element, as Aristotle calls it. A lot of the Tocqueville experts will tell you that the thing Tocqueville gets most wrong about America is the prediction that the equality of conditions will mean, by which he means roughly socioeconomic equality, right? That you don't have a permanent class of servants and a permanent class of lords because of the very broad distribution of American land, right? The very thing for which the pioneers came west. So there's a long tradition of reading Tocqueville and saying, what do we need to reproduce the conditions of the Homestead Act now that the frontier is closed? Oh, we need social mobility through higher education. Right? So this is where actually, the GI Bill and a lot of the stuff that made the research universities so huge came from. But the problem is, and there's great virtue in most people having some education. Like no question, that's good for the regime. But if you make selective professional higher education the vehicle to replace the broad distribution availability of land, you're in a doom spiral, because social mobility always involves some people falling as well as rising, right? If you want to actually be mobile. And in fact, what the universities have done is they've produced I basically think the SAT and these other standardized tests are pretty robust measures of intelligence. Right? They've selected quite well for sort of raw intellectual capability. They've then highly concentrated those people in a few places and given them professional booster rockets to go a very long way in business and law and medicine, et cetera. And then they tend to marry each other and have children who are similarly accomplished. And they tend to think more and more the same way. Right? So ironically, in the very name of Tocquevillian social mobility, the current corrupt academic elite has arisen. I mean, there are other contributing factors too, but that's a big one. So you'd have to think about broad diffusion of political and economic power differently. You have to think about things like, I don't know if this regulation's been killed or not, but why is it on the books that all new cars are supposed to have a centralized kill switch so that they can be controlled from afar, right? Why do we all depend on digital devices? Well, you guys less so, thankfully, right? But most of us in the benighted world, below the mountains, depend on digital devices, which again, collect all our data centrally, right? You have to think about how is it that you make citizens capable of governing themselves on a broad scale. That's the real political good of the economic diffusion that Tocqueville talked about. It's not, can a few people from humble backgrounds get Harvard PhDs? Of course. But that doesn't solve the problem of the relationship between the elites and the people.
Thank you for the lecture. It was superb and sublime. My question is, well, it's about the elites, it's about democracy, and it's about the frontier, something we've talked about before. Now, just so I'm certain that I have everything kind of straightened out in the cranial space here, the qualities for the elites was what? It was excellence, responsibility, competence, and humility, yeah? Did I get it?
That sounds right. I think you remember it better than I do.
Ooh, and the
Let's go
winner
back.
is... And the winner is... Yes! All
Huzzah.
right, cool. Yeah. So one of the things you spoke about earlier, which de Tocqueville talked about, was this democracy that festers because there is no pursuit. Men are kind of happy to be left alone, and that is kind of the extent of freedom.
Yeah.
And that always made sense to me until we read Huck Finn here at Wyoming Catholic College. I mean, you see this aspect of like being an elite in Huck's counterpart, Tom Sawyer, but what would you have to say about being an elite? What do you think de Tocqueville would have to say about a character like Huck Finn, which has to, in a way, always find a new frontier, has to, avoid others in this way because, he's tried being civilized and he didn't like it all that much. Yeah, would you say that maybe de Tocqueville would see this as democracy will be a lily that festers, so to speak, as long as there is no frontier, or that a frontier would be ruined by democracy?
Interesting. Yeah, there are certainly high philosophical stakes in Huck Finn, but I last read it when I was certainly too young to recognize them, so I need to give that some thought. It strikes me, though, that Huck doesn't stay the barefoot boy who will never go to school that he starts off as, right? There's something good and admirable in that pioneer spirit of independence, right? The sort of Pa Ingalls, right? As soon as the railroad gets within a day's drive, I move west spirit. But Huck learns to take responsibility for Jim, right? He learns to actually have a friend in whose fate he's invested. And he actually risks his life and his own freedom to help set him free, right? So so it's a story of overcoming individualism in part, not becoming, subject to soft despotism, but learning to be free in relation to others is a big part of the maturing, it seems to me. So what strikes me there is what both the left and right kind of caricature of bad elites have in common, right, is these are fundamentally individualistic people. Right? Whether, with the Winklevoss brothers, it's obvious, right? They want a nice, comfortable life for themselves. They want things to be easy. With the masks and the chants on Harvard Yard, it's a little bit more subtle because ostensibly this was about a cause, and I'm getting involved, and I'm doing social justice, right? These people would not see themselves as selfish individuals. But what you have here underlying this is the paradox of John Rawls, right? That Rawls helped create a left liberalism which was ultimately about defending individual private life, basically. But said, essentially, I'm crudely reducing it, but if you pay high taxes, that's the extent of your social duty, right? I can wear sweatpants every day and order 21 meals a week from DoorDash and still be a good person if I show up to the pro-Hamas protest, right? And I pay 45% of my salary in taxes, right? In other words, wielding my responsibility in society well never involves real personal sacrifice in my private life with people who see me, right? But this is why the tech mogul paradigm of elites is to show up, the power move is to show up in a hoodie, right? The old aristocratic ideal was the most powerful guy in the room dresses the most uncomfortably, because it's a sign of his office, right? It's one of the burdens, one of the compensatory sacrifices for having greater authority, right? It was actually supposed to help keep him humble, right? Like, it's not always fun to teach in a tie, right? But we do it because it reminds us that we have a teacher's duties toward you, So, insofar as both sides want to be Hakfen at the beginning of the book, that's, I think, individualism in the vicious Tocquevillian sense. But insofar as we have, I think, resources and a tradition in America of turning people into the Hakfen of the closing of the book, who actually have learned a sense of relational freedom with others, then that's the love of liberty in Tocqueville's sense.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I was thinking through a lot of different things that you were saying throughout, and it sounds to me like democracy needs an antidote of sorts, and that we can find that in education. However, the sort of education that you characterized seems to me something that is often opposed in a liberal democracy. And I think that was even illustrated by the fact that those colleges that you talked about, I was happy to see Texas had a sort of like separate, I'm from there, so I'm glad Texas was good about that.
Jury's still out on what will happen in Texas, but it's an interesting one to watch.
Yeah, I was reading about that last week. But those colleges, maybe the fact that it's not attractive to them to kind of go countercultural, go against this sort of the problems of democracy, the hyper-individualism, equality within. And then also from my experiences with other elite colleges, and there seems to be this hyper-competitiveness. And so much so that it feels like people are just like babbling at you as opposed to actually communicating, because they don't actually want you to know what they're thinking, because if you did, perhaps you could actually have a response to them, and that would destroy the image. And more, I just started to think about the metaphysical underpinning that you brought up. And Newman was looking at this in a university where you are openly discussing God and religion. And so my question is there a possibility for educating an elite that is supposed to be countercultural and is able to see metaphysical realities in a sort of holistic vision that actually allows for parts and wholes to coincide without it being Christian? Do you need to have Christianity in order to have this aristocratic education?
Yeah, excellent. Well, very well put. I don't think you have to in principle, right? I think there are non-Christian examples of people who have come to similar conclusions. One I would point to in the ancient world, I think Cicero gets very close to a Christian, almost Christian picture of a mixed regime where there's both genuinely excellent princes and genuinely respected and protected people who actually have a mutually complementary relationship. And he actually has a pedagogy about how you instill that in souls and make it a way of life, an account of law as well. However, I think grace certainly helps perfect nature here. And probably in our context, right, certainly the best chance to do this on any wide scale is going to involve, I think, confessional, publicly Christian institutions. Right? But that's not to say that I think we will find often strange, maybe unexpected allies along the way, right? There are people who just have really been shaped by the classics and love them, who see this even if they don't share in the faith, right? There are people of other religions who can see it, but to fully live out the magnanimity and humility part, I think aristocratic and democratic are easier to connect actually than magnanimous and humble without the metaphysics of gift underpinning, right? And maybe one thing I can say quickly about that is even Aristotelianism struggles with the gift part, right? Because a mere prime mover doesn't really love you, right? The world loves Aristotle's God, but Aristotle's God doesn't love the world. So it's, the magnanimous man is cold in Ethics Book 4. Right? You can try to make the magnanimous man seem nicer, but you really can't make him seem loving. But even Cicero's Prince is different, because I think Cicero has a picture of the intellect as fundamentally relational, and the will as a distinct faculty, which is sort of the loving attention of the mind, that is richer than the kind of mere reason and passion of the Greeks. So it also helps that America is very Roman.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I just want to start off by acknowledging the fact that both Hillsdale and I believe Wyoming Catholic refuse government subsidies or funding for education.
Yeah.
And as we're talking about how education is to help create this new class of elites, of, I guess, moral elites, I wonder how exactly, as a prospective student, coming from a good background, but also coming from the background of the world we live in with debt and just the ability to kind of manage our real world concerns with our idyllic hopes and dreams.
Mm-hmm.
I just was
You want to become mad in the manner of Don Quixote?
No. But I might, yeah. So, but like, I feel like this the concerns are driving a lot of young men, especially towards an escapism attitude.
Yeah.
Where people are escaping into fantasies that aren't totally, are fantasies. And I'm just wondering your opinions on that to help.
Yeah, excellent. It's very dangerous to give practical counsel without knowing the full particularities of many different situations, right? So I'm not trying to do that. But to talk about the general difficulty you raise, it seems to me, first of all, there is real injustice, right? The deck is stacked against, I think, especially young men who want to be in a position to raise families at a relatively young age. It's a hard thing to do. It's always been hard, but it's particularly hard now when the institutions and the incentives don't encourage it at all. But the response can't be simply, and I think you're referring to this as well, right? Retreat to the skilled crafts, right? Retreat to trades, do practical things that will keep you employable. That works for some people, right? I think that can be a path to a decent life. I don't mean to knock it, but it won't fix the country, right? That's part of the sort of call to arms I want to issue here, right? Is if you have the chops to do what Tocqueville says, you become thoroughly imbued by the spirit of ancient, classical, noble things, you actually have a duty to try, right? And not every man who jumps out of the landing boats on D-Day will make it ashore, right? But you should charge the machine gun nests, if you can, right? If you're crippled in both legs, don't get on that boat, right? But if you have a chance, you should try. And you should try precisely for those who won't be able to do it, right? Who don't have the family circumstances or the financial circumstances to even have a chance. So that's to say, the way to respond to injustice is, again, magnanimity, not victimhood, self-pity, right? Again, that's the playbook of the left, and it always leads to death and destruction. So maybe the last just practical thing I will say is, I think from having spent a chunk of time at places like that, I think I have a pretty good read on the virtues and vices of, the the Ivy, top 20 in the U.S. News and World Report ranking colleges. They have real virtues. Like there are really good things you can learn there. But the best graduates of a place like this are on par with the best graduates of a place like that, right? And you should have that confidence of, you know things. You have an education that, frankly, like I and my friends at Columbia would have been jealous of as sophomores and juniors, right? And therefore, some things will be harder for you because you don't have the same accumulated prestige, brand name degree going out into the world. That's a reality. But the substance of what you know and can do is very valuable. And if you put yourself in a position where someone gives you a chance, you can demonstrate that. And frankly, like it's Hillsdale grads and graduates of colleges like this that are running the government right now. Most of them are like 25, and they're like dictating the State Department's policy toward whole swaths of the world. It's a little scary, but it's also pretty breathtakingly exciting as well. And I think there's good reason to think that can be built on and improved in years to come.
Thank you very much, Dr. Foster. I wanted to ask kind of a bit more going to Tocqueville. Does he really see the situation we have today? It seems, yes, we still are very much obsessed with equality, but it seems back then, and the kind of classical definition of equality might be more what I've heard called equality of opportunity. And like this is kind of what you see in the frontier, where if each person's kind of has the same opportunity to pursue these goods in a way. And yes, there will be some elite who arise out of it, but in a democracy, at least theoretically, all have the same equality in that way. But what we have now, and maybe what you do see in these protests on Harvard Yard and such, is people seeking for what I've heard termed as an equality of outcome, where they seek to kind of see each person have the same result out of life. And maybe that's what allows them to order 21 dinners off DoorDash every week, is because they can feel not
Hopefully
guilty
not 21
about that.
dinners.
Or, sorry, not dinners, but 21 meals or whatever it is.
No, 21 dinners would be really decadent.
Very French. Because they don't need to feel guilty that there's someone less fortunate than them, or something along those lines. And especially, I'm actually thinking of last autumn, we saw both in France and in America, the government stagnated because of budget issues. They couldn't agree on a budget, and the primary issues were, what is the government providing for those who cannot fully provide for themselves?
Yes.
And so I'm just kind of wondering, have we entered into a different era of or a different definition of what equality is? And how can Tocqueville help us address that, and how can Newman help us address that?
Yes, so on Tocqueville specifically, because I do think Newman's political thought is just much less developed. It's not a hard distinction in Tocqueville. He would like it to be, right? He's a liberal in the 19th century sense. He would like a small state, and he'd like to see, as Lincoln puts it, a full and fair field open for each man's talents, right? Where you can work and build what you make of your life, and if you succeed or fail, it's mostly up to you. It's not antisocial, but it primarily is not a matter of the state. But Tocqueville sees already in his own time that the line is very hard to hold between the two. So that it's not so apparent in Democracy in America, but the recollections or the souvenirs, his late autobiographical work on the French Revolution of 1848, the one he lived through, is very interesting. So he came to power with the Second Republic, but almost immediately saw it collapse into revolutionary socialism, right? And there's even an anecdote, Marx reports at least, that he saw Tocqueville as a parliamentary deputy in the streets as Marx, was being hauled away by the police. And he said, Mr. Tocqueville, in the name of equality, save me. And Tocqueville passed him by, apparently. Right? Whether or not this is true, it captures something real, which is that Tocqueville despised Marxism and that kind of revolutionary socialism, But he saw it. It was already a political force in his day. Right? And what actually happened, the way it was kept down in France, was by a military coup in the Second Empire. Right? So Bonapartism becomes the political solution to mass democracy, universal franchise, without leveling economic equality. But that requires a popular, charismatic leader who has the support of the army. So you can't get that in every circumstance. And it's sort of a stopgap solution at best. So this is to say, the égalité imaginaire, the imaginary equality that Tocqueville identifies, which is best thought of, I think, as seeing yourself as interchangeable potentially with any other human being. Which is to say, you don't identify primarily by your role or your station in life anymore. You identify primarily as an individual. Right? You see this, actually, I don't know what your classroom custom is here, but it's become almost unthinkable in most campuses to address students by their last name. Right? The person is his or her first name. Right? You can go weeks without ever using your family name in contemporary American society. Right? But for most of human history, the hierarchical bond which you were sure to have, no matter how humble you were, was you belonged to a family. You weren't just yourself. You didn't just bear the burden of being an individual. So that's Tocqueville's response to Marx, in a way, right? Marx says, the beggar under the bridge isn't really my equal because he doesn't have the same economic circumstances as me, right? And so all has to be overthrown to realize the promise of equality. Right? And Tocqueville says, no, what we have is imaginary equality, which is to say, like, you don't see yourself as a different kind of being than the beggar, even though he has different opportunities than you. Right? But it requires a discipline of the imagination to have the one kind and not let it slip into this very close kindred spirit. Right? And that's the whole pedagogy of Marx in America, is how to train the imagination to make that distinction. But it's hard to maintain. And it leads to certain kind of hypocrisies, right? One of the reasons why people like DoorDash is because these people actually have servants, but they don't know their names. Right? It's a way of introducing a new kind of serfdom without any ongoing responsibility or relationship. And I think, in a way, the Tocquevillian way out is to be honest about the existence of aristocratic elements and try to discipline them well.
Thank you, Dr. Foster.
I'm scared now.
Yeah. You described Tocqueville's worries about the effect of studying ancient letters in a democratic society.
Yeah.
With the painting, David's painting of the Oath. And the way, and his worry was that drinking too deeply from Greek and Latin literature would lead to some kind of unrealistic political radicalism that would not produce the virtue of the Roman Republic, but the terror of the French Revolution.
Yeah.
Would you?
Well, it's good to remember, right, that the Robespierre and Marat loved to dress up in togas. Right?
That's right. Yeah. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Would you apply? Do you think that worry applies to us today? What occurs to me is that the people who articulate this worry today are the leftists who say we shouldn't read old books because it's going to make our young people sexist, white supremacist, etc.
Yep.
So does it apply in any kind of analogous way today? This kind of going back to the Greeks and Romans, maybe without Christianity, or what difference does that make? Sort of Tocquevillian versus Newman approach.
Yeah, very good. I mean, the short answer is, I think, the two easy answers on a Tocqueville level alone are soft despotism or sweet despotism is a greater problem than personal tyranny, right? It turns out like even Bonapartism is very hard to pull off in modern states, right? The general pull towards comfort and ease and security is so much stronger that I think Tocqueville's, in the spirit of Agere Contra, is willing to run the risk of a few people gaining tyrannical aspirations if a good number actually acquire free and noble souls in the process, right? So that's one level answer. Second level answer is, I think he also says, like, learn this stuff well. Don't just do a little bit of posting on X. Like, actually learn what, do the difficult parts of the learning, which is humbling and disciplining. And then things like the Achilles mercilessly slaughtering Trojans trying to surrender even into the depths of the river isn't actually the end of the story. Like, Achilles is in Hades and says it would be better to be the meanest slave up on earth than the greatest lord down here, right? So mere warrior domination, pace Nietzsche, isn't actually a path to a good or happy life. Like, so to know the classics well is to get past some of the shallow temptations already, right? So those are the two answers. But I think the third answer, the deeper Newman answer is, of course, if you try to go back anachronistically without the Christian, maybe even specifically Benedictine process of leveling and purifying, not leveling, leavening and purifying that happened, you're not actually going to get what may actually have been good in the Celtic Druidism of some of your ancient ancestors. What you're going to get is a horrifying distortion which makes you vulnerable to the worst parts of modernity. Tocqueville sees that in parts, right? He says Jesus Christ had to come to earth for us to see that all men were by nature equal. But he doesn't really develop that thought in the way that Newman can.
Thank you for your lecture. I guess speaking from some experiences of being in, medical fields and having had lots of conversations with people who are intensely educated, but from a public origin, when I tell them about having had private education and that I believe in truth that is based in Catholic ideals, and this kind of connects to Ms. Ramsey's question, how do you encourage those students on the Harvard campus that typically reduce this political conversation to a sort of us versus them, or left and right, while we do have to discuss these things in those terms because they are broader concepts?
Right.
I don't prefer to actually
broaden. It's at best a crude shorthand,
Right. The biggest response I got to my education, which I would argue gave me a multi-layered experience of just the political atmosphere, they would call it indoctrination. So how do you now, looking at what you said, multiple Hillsdale graduates or graduates from colleges like this that are Catholic running and trying to increase the sway in the political atmosphere, what do you say to these students on the Harvard campus that are afraid of indoctrinated people running the government, I guess?
It's both, I think, a question at the kind of personal friendship level and at the civic friendship level. To some extent, politically, the proof is in the pudding, right? If they make terrible mistakes, or even if they make small mistakes, it causes scandal, right? So it's not fair. They're held to a higher standard. They're reproached more quickly. The other side can get away with things for much longer and hide things much more thoroughly. But the magnanimous attitude is, all right, I'm going to have to be above reproach and live and conduct myself accordingly. I think metaphysically here, the principle is the good can never be defeated by evil. The good can only defeat itself. Right? That's the Augustinian principle, and that's a very serious worry, right? But practically, I mean, you can do this in the classroom on a small scale. It's very hard to do with a big group, unless you already have some established ethos, right? The reason why a classroom professor can do it is because there's a basis of authority coming in, of even in a very suspicious of authority environment, people generally assume the person in front of the classroom has something worth saying, right? But where you have that ethos, you can start to show people that they necessarily take certain things for granted. This is Tocqueville's point, right? We actually are not capable of rationally justifying every conviction we have. So therefore, the idea that purely open-ended, level playing field debate is ever possible is false. Right? Everybody always takes something for granted. And then the question is, do you have good reason to take what you take for granted? And if you can move someone onto that plane and get away from you're good or you're evil because you hold to X, Y, Z policy position, then you're off to the races. But it's hard. And if you're talking about abortion, it's going to be much harder than if you're talking about energy production policy or something, right? Like the more sensitive and emotionally freighted it is, the harder it's going to be to do that. But I think you have to show people that there's no neutral position, and then the best kind of grounding is going to be one in nature, which you can give a rational account of, and then nature itself points beyond itself. So that's where a theological basis is not violent or imposed, but is actually completing and building on what's already there. But you have to also be prudent about the rhetorical context in which you're operating.
As it's getting quite late, why don't we end the Q&A here and thank Dr. Foster. For
Thank you very
those who
much.
can still stay up, please join us for the wine and cheese reception. And students, also remember that you'll have another chance tomorrow afternoon to talk more with Dr. Foster.
Yeah,
There's
and
been
happy to go into anything in more detail. Happy to be grilled on more things, please.
There's been a request for the students to all take a student body photo. So could all the students come up either to the stage or maybe half on the stage and half in the front here? No crackers and cheese for you until you do it.